My mother's wedding ring wasn't in the jewelry box where I'd kept it for 43 years. I stood in my bedroom, holding the empty velvet case, feeling the weight of something far heavier than metal and stone. The box was still there, still closed, still exactly where it had always been on the corner of my dresser. But inside, nothing. Just the faint impression in the satin where it had rested since the day my mother pressed it into my palm on her deathbed and told me to keep it safe. I turned the box over in my hands twice, 3 times, as if the ring might materialize if I looked hard enough. It didn't. My breath came shallow. My heart began that frantic hammering I'd learned to recognize as the start of something bad. I was 62 years old, divorced, living alone in the house I'd bought with my own money after my ex-husband left me for someone younger. I'd spent the last 15 years rebuilding my life piece by piece, not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually, in ways I still didn't have words for. My daughter Eliana had moved back in 6 months ago after her own marriage fell apart, and I'd welcomed her with open arms. We'd been healing together, or so I thought. We'd cooked dinner side by side, watched movies, talked late into the night. I'd given her space, support, and access to my home as freely as I'd once given access to my heart. Now, standing in the silence of my bedroom with an empty jewelry box in my trembling hands, I wondered if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. I went downstairs to find her. She was in the kitchen making tea, moving around my space with the casual confidence of someone who believed they belonged there completely. She was 34, tall like me, with my same dark eyes, but her father's sharp cheekbones. She looked up when I entered, and I saw the exact moment her expression shifted from contentment to something guarded. "Where is it?" I asked. "Where's what?" She turned back to the kettle, and that simple gesture, that dismissal, sent a spike of anger through my chest. "My mother's ring, the one from her jewelry box." The kettle continued heating. Eliana didn't turn around. "I don't know anything about a ring, Mom." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I knew immediately it wasn't the first one. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I'd spent my entire life being lied to by men. My father, my husband, my business partners. I'd sworn I'd never let it happen again. And now, my own daughter was standing in my kitchen, lying to my face with the ease of someone who'd done it many times before. "The ring that belonged to your grandmother. The ring I kept in the box on my dresser. The ring that's been there since before you were born." Eliana finally turned to face me. Her jaw was set tight. "I'm not talking about this right now." "You're going to talk about it right now." "Where is my ring?" "I don't have your ring, Mom. I don't know where it is." She turned back to the kettle, and I watched her pour hot water into a mug with movements that were deliberately, aggressively calm. "Maybe you misplaced it. You're getting older. These things happen." The insinuation landed like a slap. I was 62, not 80. My mind was sharp. My memory was solid. I knew exactly where I'd put that ring because I checked on it regularly, the way some people check on photographs or letters. It was my connection to my mother. My tangible reminder that I'd come from someone who loved me. "I didn't misplace it," I said quietly, "and I want to know what happened to it." Eliana grabbed her mug and brushed past me toward the stairs. "I'm going to my room. I don't appreciate the accusation." I stood in the kitchen alone, listening to her footsteps retreat, and felt something crystallize inside me. A decision, a boundary, a determination that I would find out exactly what was going on in my own house. That night, I went through my bedroom methodically. The jewelry box was the first place I'd looked, but now I opened every drawer, checked every surface, moved aside books and picture frames. I found nothing. No ring, no note, no explanation. I moved to her room, telling myself I was just looking for clues, that this was justified, that a mother had a right to investigate her own home. Her room was neat. She'd always been organized, even as a child. But when I opened her closet, I found something that made my stomach drop. Boxes, stacked neatly on the upper shelf. Goodwill boxes, each one labeled with dates going back several months. My hands shook as I pulled them down one by one. The first box contained clothes I recognized. A sweater I'd bought at Nordstrom. A pair of jeans I'd worn maybe twice. The second held kitchen items. A set of measuring cups my mother had given me. A serving platter I'd inherited from my grandmother. The third box held books, and I recognized my own handwriting in the margins of several of them. The fourth box held items from the bathroom, towels, a robe, a collection of vintage perfume bottles I'd been collecting for 20 years. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I was hyperventilating. I forced myself to sit down on her bed and count to 10, then 20, then 30. By the time I'd regained some control of my breathing, I'd made a decision. I needed to know everything. I needed to see exactly what she'd given away. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening in my own house, because something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The next morning, I called the Goodwill store on Maple Street. I told them I was looking for items that might have been donated by mistake, that I'd like to come in and check their current inventory. The woman on the phone was helpful and kind, and I felt a wave of shame wash over me as I lied to her. But the shame was quickly overtaken by a need that felt almost primal, the need to see what my daughter had done, to understand the full extent of the betrayal. I drove to Goodwill on a Tuesday morning, and the moment I walked through the doors, I felt like I'd entered an alternate reality. There, on the racks and shelves, was my life. Not all of it, but enough to make me dizzy. I found a blazer I'd worn to important meetings, a pair of heels I'd saved for special occasions, a lamp from my living room that I'd bought on a trip to Barcelona. I found a set of dishes that had belonged to my mother, carefully wrapped and placed on a shelf. I found a jewelry box, not mine, but similar, filled with costume jewelry I'd collected over the years. I moved through the store like a ghost, picking up items, putting them back, my heart breaking with each discovery. An older woman approached me as I stood staring at a collection of my own photographs in frames, arranged on a shelf like someone else's memories. "Can I help you find something?" she asked gently. "These frames," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know where they came from?" "They came in as part of a donation about 3 weeks ago," she said. "They're lovely, aren't they? Very good quality." I nodded, unable to speak. I bought all of them, all the frames, all the dishes, the lamp, the sweater, the heels, the perfume bottles. I bought back pieces of my own life, and as I stood at the register, I felt something shift inside me. The shame was gone. In its place was a cold, clear anger. When I got home, I confronted Eliana immediately. She was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, and she barely looked up when I came in. "We need to talk," I said. "If this is about the Goodwill thing..." "It's not about one thing. It's about everything. I went to Goodwill this morning. I found my mother's dishes. I found my photographs. I found items that have been in my family for decades. I want to know why you're giving away my belongings." Eliana stood up slowly. Her face had gone pale, but her eyes were hard. "Because you have too much, Mom. You have more than you could ever need, and there are people who need these things. I was trying to help." You were trying to help? By stealing from me? I didn't steal anything. I donated items that were just sitting in your house, collecting dust. I was trying to do something good. You don't get to decide what I keep and what I give away. These are my things, my mother's things. You had no right. Eliana's face flushed. You know what? You're right. I had no right. But you also didn't notice. You didn't notice any of it for months. That says something, doesn't it? That says you have so much stuff that you don't even know what you own. The words hit me like a physical blow because there was a kernel of truth in them. I hadn't noticed. I'd been distracted, caught up in the pleasure of having my daughter home again, in the fantasy that we were healing together. I'd let my guard down. I'd trusted her. And she'd used that trust to systematically remove pieces of my life. That's not the point, I said, but my voice was shaking. The point is that you lied to me. You looked me in the face and lied. Yes, I lied. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. I knew you'd be angry and accusatory and make me feel like I'd done something terrible. You did do something terrible. You violated my trust. You went through my things without permission. You gave away my mother's ring. The moment the words left my mouth, I saw it. A flash of something in her eyes. Guilt. Confirmation. You gave away my mother's ring. I repeated, my voice steady now, certain. That ring was irreplaceable. It had sentimental value that had nothing to do with its monetary worth. Where is it? Eliana turned away from me. I don't know. It was in a box with some other jewelry. I donated it with the rest. I felt my knees weaken. The ring was gone. Sold for probably a few dollars at a Goodwill store. Bought by a stranger who would never know its history, its significance, its meaning. I sank onto the couch and put my head in my hands. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't think. No, you didn't think. That's the problem. You didn't think about me at all. You just decided that my belongings were yours to dispose of? That's not fair. I was trying to help. I was trying to make a difference. I looked up at her. You can't make a difference by stealing from your own mother. You can't justify a lie by saying you meant well. That's not how this works. But even as I said it, I realized something else was happening. This wasn't just about the ring or the dishes or the photographs. This was about something deeper, something that had been building for months. Eliana had moved into my house as a refugee from her own failed marriage, and I'd welcomed her without conditions or boundaries. I'd given her access to my space, my things, my life. And somewhere along the way, the lines between mine and hers had blurred so completely that she'd started to feel like she owned it all. Over the next few days, I discovered the full extent of what had happened. I went through the boxes in her closet methodically, cataloging everything. I found receipts in her trash from Goodwill, showing donations dating back 6 months, right around the time she'd moved in. I found evidence of at least 40 separate donations. I called the Goodwill stores and asked about their records. Some items had been sold. Some were still in inventory. A few had been purchased by other customers, and I was able to track down a couple of them through the store's records. One woman had bought a set of my mother's silverware and was happy to sell it back to me. Another had purchased several of my books and agreed to return them for a small fee. But others were simply gone, lost to the void of the second-hand market, impossible to retrieve. I started keeping a notebook. I wrote down every item I could remember, every donation I could verify, every piece of my life that had been given away without my knowledge or consent. The list grew longer and longer, and with each entry, I felt my anger crystallize into something harder, something more permanent. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern of behavior that showed a fundamental disrespect for my autonomy, my property, my right to decide what happened to the things I owned. Eliana tried to apologize. She brought me flowers one morning and left them on the kitchen counter. She made my favorite dinner and asked if we could talk. She promised it wouldn't happen again. But I found myself unable to accept any of it. The apologies felt hollow because they didn't address the real issue, which was that she'd violated my trust in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. She'd looked me in the face and lied. She'd gone through my things without permission. She'd made decisions about my property without consulting me. And worst of all, she'd done it all while living in my house, eating my food, using my utilities, accepting my hospitality. I realized with a kind of sick clarity that I didn't know my daughter anymore. Or perhaps I'd never known her at all. Perhaps I'd constructed an image of who I wanted her to be, and she'd been a completely different person all along. 1 week after discovering the boxes, I made a decision. I called a lawyer. Her name was Giara Martin, and she came highly recommended by a friend. I sat in her office on a rainy afternoon and told her the entire story. She listened without interrupting, her expression grave, her hands folded on her desk. "Technically," she said when I'd finished, "since she's your daughter and living in your home, this falls into a gray area legally. Most jurisdictions would classify this as a family matter rather than a criminal matter. However, you do have the right to ask her to leave your home. You also have the right to take legal action to recover the value of the items, though that would require proving the item's worth and establishing that she acted without your permission." "I want her out of my house," I said. The words came out cold, final, irreversible. "I can help you with that," Giara said. "I'll draft a formal notice to vacate. You'll need to give her a certain amount of time. The exact amount depends on your state's laws. But after that, you can file for eviction if she refuses to leave." "How long?" "In most states, 30 days. Some require 60. I nodded. 30 to 60 days? I could manage that. I could live in my own house for 30 to 60 days with my daughter, knowing that she'd betrayed me, that she'd lied to me, that she'd violated the sacred trust between a parent and child. I could do it because I had to, because the alternative was to pretend this hadn't happened, to accept her apologies and move on, to let her continue living in my house as if nothing had changed. And I couldn't do that. I wouldn't do that. Jara drafted the notice that afternoon, and I served it to Eliana that evening. I waited until after dinner, when we were both in the living room, and I handed her the formal letter without preamble. "What is this?" she asked, her voice small. "Notice to vacate. You have 30 days to move out." She read through it slowly, and I watched her face go through a series of expressions. Confusion, then anger, then something that looked like desperation. "You're kicking me out? Over this? Over some stuff?" "It's not about stuff. It's about trust. It's about respect. It's about the fact that you lied to me repeatedly and violated my privacy and my property." "Mom, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Please don't do this." "You made a series of mistakes. You made a choice to go through my things. You made a choice to donate them without asking. You made a choice to lie to me when I confronted you. Those aren't mistakes. Those are decisions. I was trying to help. I was trying to make a difference. I was trying to do something good." You can't do something good by stealing. You can't justify a lie by saying you meant well. That's not how it works. Not in my house, not with my things, not with my trust. Eliana stood up abruptly, the letter falling from her hands. You know what? Fine, I'll leave. I don't want to live here anyway. I don't want to live in a house with someone who thinks I'm a thief. You are a thief. You stole from me. I didn't steal. I donated. Without my permission. That's theft. She stormed out of the room, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her bedroom door slam. I sat alone in the living room, my heart pounding, my hands shaking. I'd done it. I'd drawn a line. I'd said no, and it felt both terrifying and absolutely right. But the next morning, I woke up to find that Eliana had already started packing. She'd called a friend, and by afternoon, boxes were being loaded into a U-Haul. She'd found an apartment. I didn't ask where or how she'd managed it so quickly, and she was leaving. Not in 30 days. Now. Immediately. As if she couldn't bear to spend another minute in my house, in my presence, under my judgment. I wanted to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt hollowed out. She left on a Tuesday morning. I watched from the window as she loaded the last of her boxes into the truck. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't knock on the door. She simply got in the passenger seat next to her friend and drove away. I stood at the window for a long time after the truck disappeared around the corner, feeling the weight of what I'd done settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat. That afternoon, I walked through my house room by room. It was mine again. Completely, entirely mine. Every object, every piece of furniture, every photograph was exactly where it was supposed to be. But the house felt different now. It felt emptier. It felt like a place where something had died. I went into Eliana's room and found it stripped bare except for the boxes she'd left behind. I opened them slowly, dreading what I might find. But they contained only things she'd decided weren't worth taking. Old textbooks, childhood toys, items that held no value for her. I sat on the floor of her empty room and cried. I cried for the daughter I'd thought I had. I cried for the relationship that had been damaged beyond repair. I cried for the ring that was gone forever, lost to the second-hand market, lost to a stranger who would never know its history. But I also cried for myself, because I realized, sitting in that empty room, that I had failed her in some fundamental way. I had welcomed her into my home without establishing boundaries. I had given her access to my life without protecting my own interests. I had been so eager to be the good mother, the supportive mother, the mother who was there for her daughter in her time of need, that I'd forgotten to be the mother who said no. The mother who protected herself. The mother who understood that love sometimes means setting limits. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into recovery mode. I went back to Goodwill stores across the city, searching for more of my belongings. I found a few more items and bought them back. I contacted local online marketplaces and posted about my missing items, hoping someone might recognize them. I filed a report with the police, though the officer who took my statement made it clear that without evidence of criminal intent, there wasn't much they could do. I met with Giara again to discuss whether I had any legal recourse, and she explained that pursuing a civil suit against my own daughter would be expensive, time-consuming, and unlikely to result in full restitution. The real question, she said, is what you want the outcome to be. Do you want to punish her? Do you want to recover the items? Do you want to repair the relationship? I didn't have an answer. I wanted all of those things, and none of them simultaneously. Weeks turned into months. I heard from Eliana only once, a text message that simply said, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. I was still too angry, still too hurt, still too confused about how my own daughter could have done this to me. I started therapy. I found a woman named Veralina Barnes, who specialized in family trauma, and I spent an hour every week in her office talking about my daughter, my marriage, my childhood, my patterns of trusting too easily and protecting myself too late. Verilina helped me understand that what had happened with Eliana wasn't random. It was part of a larger pattern in my life, a tendency to give too much of myself to people who didn't deserve it, to ignore red flags, to prioritize being loved over being respected. "Your daughter violated your boundaries," Verilina said during one session. "But you also allowed those boundaries to be violated? Not because you deserved it, but because you never established them in the first place. Going forward, you need to be clearer about what you will and won't accept." "But she's my daughter," I said. "I'm supposed to be forgiving. I'm supposed to be understanding." "You can be forgiving and understanding and still have boundaries. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, having clear boundaries is one of the most loving things you can do, because it prevents situations like this from happening in the first place." I thought about that a lot. I thought about how I'd let Eliana move in without discussing expectations or limitations. I thought about how I'd given her access to my entire house without establishing any sense of privacy or protection for my own belongings. I thought about how I'd prioritized being the good mother over being the healthy mother. By the time 6 months had passed, I'd recovered about 60% of the items I could identify. The rest were simply gone. My mother's ring was never found. I accepted that it was lost to me forever, and I grieved it in a way I hadn't expected to grieve an object. But it wasn't just the ring I was grieving. It was the relationship with my daughter. It was the fantasy I'd constructed about us healing together. It was the version of myself I'd wanted to be. The selfless, generous, always available mother. And the recognition that being that person had cost me something essential. I didn't hear from Eliana for almost a year. Then, one day in early spring, I received a letter. It was handwritten, several pages long, and it took me 3 tries to read it all the way through because I kept having to stop and compose myself. She apologized. Not the shallow apology she'd offered before, but a real, genuine apology that acknowledged what she'd done and the impact it had had on me. She explained that she'd been struggling with depression and anxiety, that she'd felt overwhelmed and out of control in her own life, and that going through my things had given her a sense of agency that she'd been lacking. She wasn't making excuses, she said. She was just trying to explain. She understood if I couldn't forgive her. She understood if I didn't want a relationship with her anymore. But she wanted me to know that she was sorry, that she'd been in therapy, that she was working on understanding her own patterns and behaviors. I held the letter for a long time before I responded. And when I did, I didn't rush into forgiveness. I didn't immediately invite her back into my life or my home. Instead, I suggested that we meet in neutral territory, a coffee shop, not my house, and talk about what had happened and what might be possible going forward. We met on a Saturday morning in late spring. Eliana looked different, thinner, more tired, but also somehow more real than she'd seemed in months. We sat across from each other at a small table, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally. "I'm not sure I do forgive you," I replied. "But I'm willing to try to understand what happened, and I'm willing to consider the possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship. But it's going to be different. It's going to have boundaries. I understand. You can't live in my house. You can't have unsupervised access to my things. We need to rebuild trust slowly, and trust isn't rebuilt by moving back in together and pretending nothing happened." "I understand," she said again. We talked for 2 hours that morning. We talked about her depression, her anxiety, her sense of being out of control. We talked about my tendency to give too much, to not protect myself adequately, to prioritize being loved over being respected. We talked about the ring, and I told her that I'd made peace with losing it, that I understood it was gone, and that no amount of anger would bring it back. We talked about moving forward, about what that might look like, about what we both needed in order to rebuild some kind of relationship. It wasn't a happy ending. It wasn't the kind of reconciliation you see in movies, where everything is forgiven and forgotten, and everyone goes back to normal. But it was a beginning. It was an acknowledgement that what had happened mattered, that it had consequences, and that moving forward would require work from both of us. Over the following months, Eliana and I developed a new relationship. We had lunch occasionally. We talked on the phone once a week. She came to my house for dinner, but only when I invited her, and she respected the boundaries I'd established. She never asked to stay over. She never went through my things. She never assumed that my home was her home or that my belongings were hers to dispose of. And I learned to be a different kind of mother. I learned to love her while also protecting myself. I learned to be generous without being foolish. I learned to forgive without forgetting. I learned that boundaries weren't walls. They were bridges that allowed for connection without allowing for harm. A year after our first meeting at the coffee shop, Eliana gave me a gift. It was a small box, wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a photograph of me and my mother, taken when I was about Eliana's age. It was a photo I'd thought was lost, one that had been in a frame that Eliana had donated to Goodwill. She'd tracked it down through the online marketplace. It had taken her months, but she'd found it and bought it back. "I know it's not the ring," she said, "but I wanted to give you something back. Something that matters." I held the photograph and looked at my mother's face, young and smiling, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something like acceptance. Acceptance that what had happened was real, that it had hurt, that it had changed us both, but also acceptance that we were both trying, both learning, both doing our best to move forward. I put the photograph in a frame and placed it on my dresser, right next to where my mother's ring used to sit. And every morning when I woke up and saw that photograph, I was reminded of two things. First, that I had to protect myself, that I had to establish boundaries, that I had to be willing to say no. And second, that even after betrayal, even after hurt, even after broken trust, there was still the possibility of connection, of understanding, of rebuilding what had been damaged. The ring was never found. It's still out there somewhere, in someone's jewelry box or pawn shop window, carrying its history with it, unknown and unremembered by the person who owns it now. I've made peace with that loss. I've learned that some things can't be recovered, that some damage is permanent, that some betrayals change us in ways we can't undo. But I've also learned that loss doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something new, a new understanding of ourselves, a new way of relating to the people we love, a new appreciation for the boundaries that protect us without isolating us. My relationship with my daughter is different now. It's smaller in some ways. We don't live together. We don't see each other as often. We don't have the kind of easy access to each other's lives that we once did. But it's also stronger in other ways, built on honesty rather than fantasy, on respect rather than assumption, on the understanding that love requires protection as well as generosity. If you're facing a similar situation, if someone you love has violated your trust or your boundaries, I want you to know that it's okay to say no. It's okay to establish limits. It's okay to protect yourself. even if it means disappointing the people you love. Because love without respect is just another word for being used. And you deserve better than that. You deserve to be loved and respected, to be generous and protected, to be a good person without sacrificing your own well-being. That's not selfish. That's survival. That's wisdom. That's the most important lesson I've learned in all of this. If you've experienced betrayal from someone close to you, share your story.
Your voice matters, and your experience might help someone else find the courage to set their own boundaries.